Evening. I'm Mike Perry. I'm the Executive Director of the Army Heritage Center Foundation. The foundation is the Friends Group for the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, a component of the Army War College, and the Army's largest archives research center for the history of our Army and its soldiers. Tonight, I'm very pleased to invite Colonel Retired Weddle here for a talk on the American Revolution. Kevin is a professor of military theory and strategy at the U.S. Army War College. He graduated from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, New York, and served 28 years as a combat engineer officer in a variety of command and staff positions. He is a veteran of Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm and Operation Enduring Freedom. Colonel Weddle's military assignments include a tour of duty at West Point in the History Department, and as the Advanced Strategic Arts Program, the Deputy Dean of Academics at the Army War College. He held the Maxwell D. Taylor Chair of Profession of Arms. In 2019, he served as the Colonel L. Garwood Visiting Professor at Princeton University. Dr. Weddle has led dozens of civilian and military groups to battlefields in the United States, including Vicksburg, Antietam, Gettysburg, Grant's Overland Campaigns, and others. In addition, he's led numerous groups onto European battlefields. Colonel Weddle holds a master's degree in history and civil engineering from the University of Minnesota and a doctorate in history from Princeton University. He has written numerous articles for popular and scholarly journals, and his first book, Lincoln's Tragic Admiral, The Life of Samuel Francis DuPont, won the 2006 William E. Colby Award, was a runner-up for the Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt Naval History Prize, and won the Army War College's Faculty Writing Award. He has appeared as an online expert in a widely acclaimed History Channel documentary on Washington in 2020. His History of the Saratoga Campaign, The Compleat Victory, Saratoga and the American Revolution, was published by Oxford University Press on February 1st, 2001, and will be the topic of this conversation today. Kevin, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Let me share my screen here. Okay, do you see it okay there, Mike?
I see it fine.
All right. Okay, well, thanks, Mike, for that very nice introduction, and hi, everybody. And thanks all of you for participating this evening. As a faculty member at the Army War College, it's a real honor for me to be hosted by the Army Heritage Center Foundation for this presentation. Now, normally, I would like to start off with some hilarious humor, but humor never comes across very well in this kind of virtual presentation, so I think I'll just jump right in. Okay, so tonight we're going to discuss one of the most pivotal military campaigns in American history. The Saratoga campaign included 10 battles and engagements and numerous challenging maneuvers, and it lasted almost 5 months. The campaign was complex, fluid, and multidimensional, and it was shaped by countless interactions and contingencies that played out over hundreds of square miles. The personalities involved were as fascinating as any you'll ever encounter. But more important than that, it changed the very character of the American Revolution. Now, my book on Saratoga, which was just published a couple weeks ago, which coincidentally has the same title as this presentation, examines the campaign in all of its political, strategic, and military complexity, and dissects the strategy, decision-making, and leadership of all the key players on both sides. But obviously, in the short time we have this evening, we're going to be flying along at wave top level. And I'll have to leave out a lot of the important elements of the story, but I'll try to set the strategic context and provide an overview of the campaign and its impact on the war. So hopefully we'll be able to fill in some of the gaps during Q&A, and of course, I hope you read the book. Now, in late August 1777, Britain's King George III received momentous news. Now, these great tidings so thrilled the monarch of Great Britain that he burst into his wife's chambers, shocking the ladies in waiting with his unseemly behavior, and he waved the message in the air and exclaimed, "I have beat them. I have beat the Americans." Now, he had just learned that British Lieutenant General John Burgoyne, his army, and Native American allies had captured the strategically vital American fortress at Fort Ticonderoga, which sat astride the Great Lake Champlain invasion route from Canada. Now, this victory, achieved with almost no casualties, convinced the king and his ministers that the military strategy that they had put in place the preceding spring to end the American Revolution was going according to plan. But less than 2 months after the king's impromptu celebration, Burgoyne and his army met with an unprecedented disaster and the British were subsequently faced with a very different war. Now, how did this come about, and what were the implications for this defeat? Now, if you consider the strengths and weaknesses of both sides, if you had an Excel spreadsheet and you compared the American side with the British side, it would seem that any outcome of a war between the two would be clear, would be obvious. But you know, no war is just based on numbers, and so things don't necessarily turn out the way you think they might. Now, I'm not going to talk about all the causes of the American Revolution, but I do want to put the campaign into some context with the military operations that preceded it. So if you'll follow me along on this map, first of all, of course, we all know Lexington and Concord, April 75, the shot heard around the world. On May of 75, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold, Americans seized the fort of Ticonderoga, and later the Americans would move its guns to Boston. The Battle of Bunker Hill in July of 75, this bloody battle convinced the British that subduing the rebellion would not be an easy task. After that, new British commanders would come in, the Howe brothers. I'll talk about them in a second. And shortly after, Washington becomes the American commander-in-chief. The Americans attempt to take Quebec in December of 75. It turns out to be a disaster. Benedict Arnold is up there again. In February of 76, the British under General Henry Clinton try to take and fail to take Charleston. They will later on. The British evacuate Boston and move to Halifax, Nova Scotia. So in May of 76. So for a period of months, several months, there's no British soldiers in the American colonies. Long Island, but they come back shortly thereafter. They conduct a brilliant joint operation on Long Island in New York City, where they defeat the Americans under George Washington, but they do not destroy this brand new American army. The Americans will retreat across New Jersey as the army slowly will dwindle away to almost nothing after a cautious British pursuit. The Brits will try to invade from Canada. They'll get as far as Crown Point, which is just a little bit north of Fort Ticonderoga, before the winter comes on and they have to abandon that attempt. And finally, in December of 76 and January of 77, Washington will conduct a campaign that will basically stop the bleeding of the American army at battles of Trenton and Princeton. So with that as a lead up, what was the policy and strategy on both sides? Now, strategy, that word strategy, it may be one of the most overused and misused words in the English language. You hear it all the time on the news and sports and everything. It's usually used wrong. Now, strategy, just simply put, is the calculated application of ways and means to achieve a political objective. Now, it sounds really simple, but if it was simple, we'd be a lot better at it. In truth, strategy is very, very, very difficult. But first, you have to come up with what are your desired objectives. For the Americans, of course, it's pretty straightforward: independence. For the British, it's suppress the rebellion, return to the status quo. Now, there's a lot of ways you can try to achieve your objectives. We're going to concentrate on the military element of power. So we'll look at British and American military strategy. There you can see the king. He's adamant. He does not want to even consider independence here in late 76, early 77. So what is British military strategy? Now, these are the Howe brothers. They're the ones who are going to be commanding the British military forces in North America. On the left there is General Sir William Howe. His brother on the right, Admiral Lord Richard Howe. So it's the Army commander on the left and the naval commander on the right. And so what they try to do, they start out wanting to gain back territory, hope they can destroy the American forces. They capture some key American cities. They're looking to split the more rebellious New England colonies away from the less rebellious, or they think less rebellious, middle colonies and southern colonies. The Royal Navy is primarily used to support ground operations. And later on, General Howe is going to try to seek decisive battle against George Washington. So their military strategy will evolve as they go along. The American military strategy will also evolve. It starts off with what military historians will call a war of posts, basically fighting from a series of fixed locations, hopefully dug in fortified locations like the Battle of Bunker Hill. They're hoping that the Brits will fight as stupidly as they do at Bunker Hill, which turns out to be a dubious assumption. Howe fails to do that in New York and Long Island in the summer of fall of '76, but he also doesn't destroy Washington's army. Now, after being beaten soundly on Long Island and New York, George Washington begins to adopt what we call a modified Fabian strategy. What is a Fabian strategy? It's a strategy that's named after the Roman general Fabius Maximus during the Second Punic War. Basically, it's to concentrate your army, protect your army, fight only when the conditions are favorable, wear down the British with militia supported by continental regular troops, hit and run raids. Later on, they'll do some guerrilla-like operations. Basically, it's a war of attrition and exhaustion. The bottom line is you don't want to allow your army to get decisively defeated. So the strategic situation in early 1777 is the British occupying New York City. Washington's army has escaped destruction. Trenton and Princeton, the battles of Trenton and Princeton basically stop the bleeding, and George Washington concentrates on rebuilding and maintaining the army. And on the British side, they're looking to seek a war-winning strategy for 1777. So that's what they're hoping to do. So these are the architects of British military strategy in 1777. And one of the most fascinating and confusing things about the Saratoga campaign is how the British developed and executed that strategy in 1777. So at the top, clockwise from the top, we've got the King George III, who was heavily involved in strategy development and personnel decisions. And then going clockwise, we have General Sir William Howe. I've already mentioned him. He's the commander-in-chief in North America, minus Canada, with his headquarters in New York City. At the bottom is Lieutenant General John Burgoyne, who had been the second in command in Canada, but he's now in London. And on the left there, we have Lord George Germain, who is a former general, and he's Secretary of State for the Colonies. And he's the guy who's responsible for managing the war in America. Now, in late 1776 and early 1777, both Burgoyne and Howe offer up competing plans for ending the rebellion. And it's ultimately up to Germain to reconcile these two plans and to issue guidance that would give the British the best chance for success in 1777. Now, because Burgoyne is in London, he's able to press his case directly to the King and Lord Germain in January of 1777. And this is his plan. What he wants to do is he wants to use Lake Champlain and Lake George as an invasion route for the main body coming down from Canada. You can see that from the arrow there. They want to seize Fort Ticonderoga, gain loyalist support, and reach Albany by the fall. And then a supporting force will come down from Canada via Lake Ontario and then into the Mohawk River Valley, also then meeting the main force coming down from Canada at Albany. And finally, they want to link up with Howe's army, Howe's big army there in New York City, coming up the Hudson River. The idea is to defeat the American Northern Army as it presents itself, split the more rebellious New England colonies from the rest of America by gaining control of the Hudson Highlands and the Hudson River Valley, and then conduct further unspecified operations into New England. Now, on paper, this is a pretty imaginative but very complex plan. In reality, it'd probably be pretty difficult to pull off today, let alone in late 18th century, because of the distance, time, weather, logistics challenges over very, very rough, unforgiving wilderness terrain. But it was enthusiastically embraced by both the King and Lord Germain. Now, Howe's plan changes a couple different times, but the final version called for taking Philadelphia. And in the process, he hoped that this would lure Washington into a decisive battle, which would destroy the main American army and thus win the war. So by early 1777, Howe had realized that George Washington and the main American army was that center of gravity of the American Revolution. Now, when Howe first presented his plan, Germain assumed that he would march to New York City, from New York City to Philadelphia overland. But Howe had absolutely no stomach for this kind of operation because it would require securing his lines of communications back to New York City. And his separated garrisons had already suffered from American raids throughout the winter. So instead, he decides to use the Royal Navy, commanded by his brother, to transport his army by sea. Now, there's a lot of good things about going by sea, but as it turns out, speed is not one of them. So at any rate, once he threatened Philadelphia, he assumed George Washington would be forced to defend it, and he would have his decisive battle. So these are the two competing plans. So the huge challenge for the Brits was to either, pick one of these two options and go with it, or somehow coordinate the two into some sort of coherent military strategy, or come up with something entirely different. So one of the major problems with these competing plans is the location of the decision makers. You have three of the big decision makers, the King, Germain, and Burgoyne, sitting there in London, and you have the other one sitting in New York City. There's 3,000 miles. They're 3,000 miles apart. And the problem, of course, with late 18th century is the tyranny of distance means that it could take up to 3 months or more for a simple exchange of messages. So, how do you coordinate a strategy when you have a situation like that? Also, in North America itself, distance is an issue. A message can only travel as fast as a person can ride on horseback. And just to give you some idea, it's 300 miles from the battlefields near Saratoga to Philadelphia. It's 200 miles from Canada down to the Saratoga battlefield. So these are huge distances that they have to deal with. So again, how do you coordinate strategy when you have a situation like this? It's tricky. So these are the three folks. There's Germain and the two competing planners there. So Germain has to come up with an overall plan. What he does is he picks a middle ground, which, as we all know, sometimes that is not the best idea. So what he does, he basically approves Burgoyne's plan. He also approves Howe's plan, but he tells Howe that he wants him to support Burgoyne once he takes Philadelphia. But Howe doesn't, because of that tyranny of distance I just talked about, Howe doesn't receive clear instructions to assist Burgoyne until he's already at sea heading for Philadelphia. And by that time, it's way too late. So it gets very, very confusing. And in my book, I've got a detailed appendix where I try to trace all these letters and orders on who wrote what, when did they send it, when was it received, and all that stuff. And you can try to follow along on why this became very confused. So with the King and Germain's approval in his pocket, Burgoyne sets sail from England and arrives in Quebec in early May to prepare his army to invade New York via Lake Champlain. At the same time, Howe, who remember is the commander-in-chief, he had already received orders from Germain and the King approving his plan, with just a suggestion that he should support Burgoyne. So this is a problem. Now, Howe writes a letter to Burgoyne in Canada, basically telling him, now, don't expect any help from me because I'm going to Philadelphia. But Burgoyne presses on anyway, confident, probably overly confident, and utterly unconcerned. So that's really the situation. And everything that happens in this campaign will flow from that strategy. And I would argue this is a bad strategy because it's uncoordinated and it's confusing and it leads to misunderstanding and all sorts of problems down the road, which we'll, of course, talk about. So Burgoyne's objectives, just real quick, Burgoyne's in his almost 10,000 man army departs from Canada on the 14th of June, 1777, and they arrive outside of Fort Ticonderoga on the 2nd of July. Brigadier General Barry St. Leger takes a force of about 1,800 men. He leaves on the 23rd of June, and he arrives at the head of the Mohawk River on 2 August. Howe's main force loads on ships on the 8th of July, but they're not able to set sail for Philadelphia until the 23rd of July. And due to contrary winds, they don't land at the head of the Chesapeake Bay south of Philadelphia until the 25th of August. So there you can see speed is not going to be one of the, mobility is really good using the Royal Navy, but speed, depending on the wind, is not all that great. The American Army in New Jersey is commanded by George Washington, and the American Northern Army is commanded by Major General Philip Schuyler. Their objectives: stop any invasion coming down from Canada, and then, of course, Washington wants to preserve his main army. So here are the comparison of forces between the two here. On the left, you see Major General Philip Schuyler, who commands the American Northern Army, and the Lieutenant General John Burgoyne. So the British Army consists of British regulars, German mercenaries, Canadians, and Native Americans. Burgoyne's Native Americans, he wanted 1,000. He only got about 500. And St. Leger also has lots of Native Americans with him as well. The Americans, Continentals, are members of the American Regular Army. They consisted of regiments drawn from the different states. And the militias, of course, are short-term locals. And during this campaign, they'll primarily come from New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. Now, Major General Philip Schuyler, commanding the Northern Department, including Fort Ticonderoga and the Northern Army, he's a native New Yorker. He's from Albany, the Albany area. He lived in the Saratoga area. He's an upper-class patrician, and he comes across as a bit haughty. He's not particularly well-liked amongst the soldiers, especially by militia troops and New Englanders, and that's going to cause a problem. Now, we'll first start with Burgoyne's initial invasion and how the campaign played out. The first step was to take Ticonderoga, which Burgoyne assumed would be the toughest part of his campaign. Now, as I already mentioned, Burgoyne and the army departed Canada on the 14th of June. They arrive outside Fort Ticonderoga on the 2nd of June. Now, through some really skillful maneuvering, Burgoyne is able to convince the American commander, Major General Arthur St. Clair, that's his Sinclair, actually it's pronounced Sinclair, on the left there, that his position was hopeless, and Burgoyne outnumbered the Americans by about 2 to 1. And so Sinclair orders the evacuation of the fort with almost no resistance. And so by the 6th of July, basically, the Americans will evacuate the fort, and Burgoyne is able to just march in. I'm pretty critical of Sinclair's leadership in my book, so but I won't dwell on that. So the bottom line, though, is in a matter of days, Burgoyne had taken possession of the great fortress of Ticonderoga. Now, it's impossible to overstate the negative impact on Americans caused by the loss of this fort. Washington, Congress, the nearby state governments, they're absolutely appalled that Sinclair and Schuyler had allowed this to happen. They believed the fort was almost impregnable. And the easy victory fed Burgoyne's overconfidence, since he had initially believed that taking Ticonderoga would be the most difficult part of his campaign. Now, while all this is happening, what's Washington up to? Now, Washington has his army near Morristown, New Jersey. And as the commander-in-chief of the American forces, all the American forces, to include Schuyler's Northern Army and all the other American forces scattered about, he was the guy in charge. He had to keep Congress informed. He had to respond to congressional questions, tasking, incorporate foreign officers, feed, equip, and train the armies, communicate with the governors, militia support, not to mention actually commanding and fighting his army. In the summer of 1777, most of his attention was focused on what Howe was trying to do. But through all that, he has his eye on what's going on 300 miles to the north. And he supports the panicky Major General Schuyler with wise counsel, advice, support, and with reinforcements that Schuyler desperately needs. And the most important help that he sends Schuyler is sending experienced leaders. Now, who does he send? He sends Major General Benedict Arnold, his most aggressive combat commander. He sends Major General Benjamin Lincoln, who had a great positive influence on militia soldiers. He sends other general officers, Nixon, Glover, and a few others. And he sends his most elite force, Colonel Daniel Morgan and his 500 riflemen from the main army. Think American Special Forces today. They're clearly his most elite fighting force. And he thinks that, you know, the Northern Army needs this help, so he sends that elite force, the only one he's got, up to help Schuyler up north of Albany. So Washington has this, one of the things I talk about at length in the book is Washington has this strategic sense that's lost on the British commanders. In other words, he sees the entire theater of operations as a whole, where Howe does not. Now, Washington knows that any operations in the north is going to affect his operations down in New Jersey and vice versa. And as the commander-in-chief, he has to try to coordinate the overall strategy as best he can, and this Howe does not do. Howe was laser focused on Philadelphia at the exclusion of virtually everything else. Now, we've talked about Burgoyne's easy capture of Fort Ticonderoga. Let's look at that supporting column that was supposed to go down the Mohawk River to help Burgoyne get to Albany. Okay, so Brigadier General Barry St. Leger departs Canada on the 23rd, and as he approached the Mohawk River, he encounters Fort Stanwix. Now, Fort Stanwix was thought to be in ruins, but instead he finds it repaired and manned by American soldiers. So St. Leger had to defeat that fort before he could possibly proceed. So on the 2nd of August, he begins a siege of Fort Stanwix. Now, the British column consists of about 1,800. It had regulars, German and British, loyalists, Canadians, and Native Americans. The American garrison fluctuates from about 550 to about 750. So the Americans are outnumbered about 3-1, basically worse odds than they faced at Ticonderoga. The American garrison at Stanwix is under the inspired leadership of Colonel Peter Gansevoort, who resists all efforts by St. Leger to take the fort by force or to force it to surrender. Now, this is a stark contrast between the leadership of Gansevoort at Fort Stanwix and St. Clair at Ticonderoga, and I talk about that contrast in the book. So there you can see St. Leger will come down. He'll start a siege of Fort Stanwix there. Now, on the 6th of August, not long after the British begin their siege of Fort Stanwix, an American militia relief force is ambushed on their way to the fort and almost destroyed by a detachment sent out by St. Leger, composed in large part of Native Americans. The fighting during the Battle of Oriskany is absolutely horrific, and both sides suffer heavy casualties, which leads later on to the mass desertion of St. Leger's Native American allies. 2 weeks later, Major General Benedict Arnold will lead a detachment of the Northern Army up the Mohawk to relieve the Stanwix garrison. And by that time, most of his Indians had deserted, so St. Leger realizes that his mission has failed, and he gathers his men and returns to Canada in late August. Arnold then marched to Stanwix, made sure the fort was no longer at risk, and quickly returns the main army north of Albany. So Gansevoort and the Stanwix garrison had held out for 22 days, and the siege of Fort Stanwix, I think, is one of the most interesting and inspiring stories of the entire campaign. And it was the first good news for the Americans in a very long time. So with Howe going to Philadelphia and not coming up the Hudson River, and now St. Leger abandoning the effort to push down the Mohawk River Valley to meet Burgoyne at Albany, 2 of the 3 columns from the original plan were out of the picture, and Burgoyne is on his own. So now we're going to zero in. We're going to zero in on this area where the rest of the campaign is going to play out. So this is a close-up of operations from Ticonderoga to Saratoga. Now, Burgoyne seizes Ticonderoga without a fight, as I mentioned before, on the 6th of July. And then he left a large garrison behind to hold the fort of about 1,500 men. The American garrison had marched overland to the east to escape, and they're closely pursued by the British. And on the 7th of July, the small but important Battle of Hubbardton takes place, where the British will catch Sinclair's rear guard, which basically stopped the British pursuit. Burgoyne also caught and scattered other retreating Americans at Skenesboro. There you can see that third little red flash there. After losing Ticonderoga, Schuyler concentrated the army at Fort Edward. You can see his army there in blue, just south of that last little flashpoint there. Now, Burgoyne moves his entire army to Skenesboro on the 11th of July, this takes quite a bit of time. Burgoyne stays at Skenesboro until the 24th of July, almost 2 full weeks, a delay that allows Schuyler, the American commander, to destroy bridges, block roads, and basically harass his forces. In the meantime, reacting to the awful news of the loss of Fort Ticonderoga, George Washington sends Benedict Arnold to help Schuyler, and he arrives on the 24th of July. And he immediately injects some, much needed energy into the Northern Army. As Burgoyne slowly advances south from Skenesboro to Fort Edward, Schuyler will pull the American army back, as you can see there on the map. Burgoyne, who had departed Canada without enough logistics support, soon finds himself short of supplies, food, fodder for his animals, and particularly transport, horses, wagons, oxen, carts, things like that. And as the Americans fell back, they continued to delay and harass the slowly advancing British. But Schuyler's pleas to New England governors for militia reinforcements fall on mostly deaf ears. Now, Schuyler does a good job delaying Burgoyne and rebuilding the shattered Northern Army after Ticonderoga, but there's very little indication of that in his panicky messages back to his superiors in Congress and to George Washington. And they continue to get this drumbeat of just despairing messages from Schuyler, even though he's doing a pretty solid job where he is up there in New York. Now, Burgoyne arrives at Fort Edward on the 1st of August, as you can see on the map. He stays 2 more weeks and then marches to Fort Miller. He stays at Fort Miller for over 3 weeks, gathering 30 days of logistics supplies for a push on Albany. The logistics strain and supply shortages are really starting to tell by this point. So while at Fort Miller, he decides to send out a large detachment of primarily German troops to seize cattle and supplies known to be at Bennington, Vermont. You can see them moving along there. On the 16th of August is the Battle of Bennington. This takes place when General John Stark and his predominantly New Hampshire militia force destroys Burgoyne's detachment. So Burgoyne loses almost 1,000 men in this engagement. Of course, 1,000 men that he can hardly afford to lose. So after this Bennington disaster, Burgoyne has 2 options. He can retreat back to Fort Ticonderoga, a defensible place from which he could spend the winter, or he could continue south and drive on to Albany. He decides to drive on to Albany. Now, he would later claim that he made this decision because his orders offered him no alternative. But of course, this is nonsense. Commanders are paid the big bucks to use their judgment, especially isolated in the New York wilderness and shackled to a plan written in London 6 months before. Indeed, his orders even included a clause that said he should always act according to circumstances. So the loss of almost his entire foraging detachment indicated that also, when you think about it, the loss of this foraging detachment indicated pretty strongly that the Americans had recovered from the shock of Fort Ticonderoga and had bounced back, and indeed bounced back with a vengeance. Also, by this time, Burgoyne knew that St. Leger had had to retreat back to Canada and that Howe was almost certainly not coming up the Hudson. In other words, he had all the information he needed to make an informed decision. He had also received confirmation, although he shouldn't have needed it, on the 3rd of August that Howe was indeed heading for Philadelphia, and that General Clinton had been left behind in New York City, who might be able to provide some support, but that was about it. So that's the situation there after the Battle of Bennington. Now, George Washington and the Congress finally get fed up with Schuyler's relentless negativity, and Congress basically relieves him of command of the Northern Department, and he's replaced by Major General Horatio Gates, and I'll talk about him in a second. Now, Gates arrives at the Northern Army headquarters north of Albany shortly after the Battle of Bennington in late August to take command from Schuyler. And he soon started edging the army north to a place called Stillwater, and ultimately to a place called Bemis Heights, about 4 miles farther to the north. There he'll dig in and he'll wait. Like Schuyler, Gates asked for militia reinforcements, and this time these requests are heeded, in part because Gates is popular with New Englanders, and also because of Burgoyne's Native Americans had been basically massacring a lot of people, both loyalists and patriots, and the continued invasion threat, of course, with Burgoyne's continued advance. So New England militias start to arrive by the hundreds, and then ultimately they will arrive by the thousands. Now, Burgoyne will cross the Hudson River to the west bank on the 13th of September, and he essentially cuts off his lines of communications back to Fort Ticonderoga. Okay, so there you can see that's the situation as we head into the first the 2 main battles of Saratoga. So who were the 2 men who faced off on the west bank of the Hudson in September of 1777. Well, General Gates on the left, the American General Gates, he's a former British Army officer who served in the French and Indian War in North America. He married an American girl, settled in the colonies, and quickly became Americanized, so that when the Revolution began, he offered his services to the Continental Army, and he served under Washington. In 1777, he's 50 years old. He's a good manager. He understands logistics. He believes strongly in defensive warfare, especially with using ill-trained American troops. He also understood how to best employ American militia forces, and he didn't disparage them all the time like many of his expatriate contemporaries. He desperately wanted an independent command and thought he was a much better leader than George Washington. Although Gates and Washington had a really good relationship early in the war, it had deteriorated by 1777. Now, Burgoyne on the right, I love that portrait of Burgoyne. He was a career British cavalry officer. He's 55 in 1777. This portrait was several years before 1777. He's known to be very aggressive and flamboyant, also arrogant and pompous. He's also very well liked by his troops because he's always concerned about their welfare, unlike a lot of the senior British officers back in that period. He served in America early in the Revolution, but he doesn't really have much respect for Americans or American soldiers, and this is magnified after the easy capture of Ticonderoga. He is a playwright and a member of Parliament. He was also a favorite of King George III. Despite serving almost his entire adult life in the British Army, this is really his first real independent command. So now these are the comparison of forces as we get into mid-September. You can see if you add up the forces on either side, that basically it's a wash. There's about 6,700 Americans and about 6,500 British. So very evenly matched. But notice now Burgoyne only has about 50 Native Americans left. The rest had deserted after the disaster at Bennington. And so this meant that his ability to scout, collect intelligence, and screen his army from the prying eyes of the Americans is severely limited. So this is a photo I took, it's a photo that's also in the book. I took a couple years ago from Bemis Heights, where the Americans were dug in. You can see from this image how the position commands both the Hudson River and the road to Albany on your right. So this is a view looking north from Bemis Heights. Now, as I mentioned, on the 13th of September, Burgoyne crossed to the west bank of the Hudson, moved slowly south until he was only a couple miles away from the American army under Gates, dug in here at Bemis Heights. Because he had lost almost all of his Indians, Burgoyne didn't have very good intelligence on the American dispositions, but he reasoned that Gates's left or his west flank could be turned so he could continue on to Albany. So his main effort was toward that end, to get around Gates's left and move on to Albany. Major General Benedict Arnold, commanding the American left flank, also knew about this vulnerability, and he figured Burgoyne would try to take advantage of it. The aggressive Arnold urged Gates to strike preemptively, but the more cautious, defensive-minded Gates would not allow that. Finally, on the 19th of September, 1777, these two main armies will collide at the First Battle of Saratoga, also known as the Battle of Freeman's Farm. I'm going to go through this very, very quickly because I want to leave time for questions. So basically, this battle will take place with Burgoyne moving forward with three different columns. You can see those columns moving forward. Burgoyne is in the middle. Arnold will suggest to Gates that they send out Morgan's riflemen to attack and basically develop the situation, and Gates agrees. So you see Morgan going out. Morgan's driven back, and Gates sends some other forces forward to help Morgan, and they put a lot of pressure on the center British column. The right British column will move over to assist, and then as the Americans continue to do quite well there against the British, the Germans, who are basically the left column of the British, will send over another force, hit the Americans in the flank, and force them to fall back. So only a small fraction of the American forces are engaged in this battle. Gates retains the bulk of his forces behind fortifications on Bemis Heights because, again, he thinks the most important thing is to block that Albany road in the Hudson River. So Burgoyne technically wins the battle because he holds on to the ground, but he experiences heavy casualties, double those of the Americans. And time is not on Burgoyne's side. So Burgoyne is now faced with another big decision. Do you push on to Albany or do you fall back? So he directs his army to basically prepare defensive positions and dig in. And as he pondered his options, Sir Henry Clinton throws him a lifeline. Now, Clinton, Howe's second in command, had been left behind in New York City with instructions to hold the city and, if possible, to help Burgoyne. So the last time Clinton had heard from Burgoyne, everything was going well. And then all of a sudden, he receives a message in late September saying things are not going well, and please, could you please help me? So Clinton pulls together a relief expedition, and he moves up the Hudson River, trying to at least draw off Gates away from Burgoyne. He's able to seize the two American fortresses guarding the Hudson, and then he continues on up as far as present-day Kingston, New York. But that's as far as he can go, because between Clinton quickly finds out that between Clinton and Burgoyne, which is about 70 miles, there's all sorts of American militia and continental forces in between. So about all Clinton can do is turn around and go back. So while this futile rescue attempt is playing out, there's also drama on the American side. Gates and his second in command, Benedict Arnold, they have a bitter quarrel over who should have credit over the 19 September Battle of Freeman's Farm victory and over what to do next. So for almost 2 weeks, the two generals embark on this nasty war of letters, despite the fact that their headquarters are only a half a mile apart. But contrary to the standard account of Saratoga, by the time the second Battle of Saratoga takes place, they were once again able to work together. Now, it's almost impossible to know exactly the number of soldiers in Gates's command after the first battle, but the army probably numbered at least 11,000 by this time because of the influx of militia. But Burgoyne, even though Burgoyne probably still has a small chance, his delay in not pressing his advantage right after the first battle or retreating back north as he waited for Clinton to get closer was a fatal error. As he got weaker, Gates got stronger. Finally, Burgoyne, desperate for food for his men and animals, decides to personally lead a 1,700-man reconnaissance force with a twofold mission. First, and most importantly, forage for food and fodder. Second, to see if it was possible to get around Gates's army and make a dash to Albany, and there to spend the winter and or meet with Clinton. So it was a desperate attempt because his army is in a poor condition by this time. But he decides to go ahead. And of course, although he couldn't know it, Clinton had already turned back to New York City. So again, I'm going to go through this very quickly so we can wrap up. So basically what happens, Burgoyne will personally lead this 1,700-man force out from the fortifications. They find a field of wheat and they immediately start harvesting that wheat. The Americans spot this this movement. They send Morgan out again, Morgan's riflemen, and soon another brigade. And as the Americans immediately start inflicting heavy casualties on the British, Burgoyne tries to conduct an orderly retreat, but his aide is shot down trying to deliver the message, and soon the British line starts to break. Arnold sees what's going on. He rides back to the American position. He asks Gates to send out another brigade. Gates agrees, and another brigade goes out under Arnold's personal command. And they basically force the British and Germans back into their fortifications. Arnold, with this new force, tries to force one of the British fortifications, the light infantry redoubt. He's unable to do so. He sees a flaw in the British defensive positions, and he personally leads another attack directly into the German fortified camp there. You can see, and they overrun and seize the German Bremen's fortified camp, it was called. In this attack, Arnold himself is seriously wounded. The German commander is killed, but the Americans have now basically outflanked the British, and Burgoyne has no choice but to to order his army to fall back because now they're outflanked. And as night falls, and with the Americans firmly entrenched on his right, Burgoyne first orders his army to fall back, and then the next day he orders a full retreat to the north. Gates slowly follows as more and more militia arrive until the American army exceeded 17,000 men. Soon, the exhausted British army grinds to a halt near the little town of Saratoga, present-day Schuylerville, after traveling only about 8 miles. And there, they are quickly surrounded by the Americans. So after several days of tense negotiations, terms were agreed to on the 16th of October. Burgoyne had left Canada with 10,000 men in only 15 weeks after seizing the great fortress of Ticonderoga. He ends up surrendering almost 6,000 soldiers. And on 17 October, while an American band played Yankee Doodle, Burgoyne surrendered his army to Gates, as depicted in this famous Trumbull painting that now hangs in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. So when news of Burgoyne's surrender arrived in London on December 2nd, the king was said to actually collapse. And although the king was still obstinate to continue the war, his ministers and other key people began to have doubts. A domestic political firestorm followed. Lord Chatham, William Pitt the Elder, who was a foe of the American war, in the House of Lords called the defeat a melancholy disaster. Washington, when he heard about it, of course, called it a great and glorious event. So what are the short-term implications of Saratoga? Well, there's only 2 large field armies, British field armies in North America, and now they've just lost one. American morale, of course, soars. British morale collapses. Now foreign intervention is now not just possible, but probable. There's all sorts of opposition in Parliament, and the opposition that's there gets emboldened, and they also gain support. Now the British have to plan for homeland defense and defense of their overseas possessions, as well as facing the Americans. So the British are desperate. They offer Americans favorable terms, but it's too little too late. So that's obviously a problem. Long-term implications, well, 2 days after the French learned of the victory on the 4th of December, Louis XVI orders that negotiations be started that would lead to an alliance with the U.S. Saratoga offered the opening Benjamin Franklin's diplomacy could exploit, and he placed France off Great Britain. And so soon, on the 6th of February in 1778, the French and Americans signed the Franco-American alliance. And the British will soon declare war on France on the 17th of March. So now, basically what's happened is Saratoga has led directly to what Britain feared the most: war against one or more major continental powers, while trying to at the same time subdue the rebellion in France, or in America. So now France has come in 1778, and then Spain, which would enter the war in June of 1779. So let's circle back to where we began, strategy. Now, the American objectives is not going to change. The British objectives, though, they change. They still want to end the rebellion, but now they tell the Americans, look, we'll accept almost any terms short of independence. And of course, the Americans will turn that down. And now the British have to focus on defeating France, their mortal enemy. British military strategy, they basically change out all the commanders. They start more of a naval war, limited offensive, reduce bases, defend homeland and overseas possessions, attack the French in the French West Indies, and then ultimately they'll embark on what historians will call the Southern strategy, moving into the American southern states or southern colonies, they consider it. The American military strategy, of course, the guy on the left there is Lafayette. George Washington is going to continue the Fabian strategy, but now he has more opportunities to do other things, like exhausting the British Army, using more irregular warfare in the South, and now leveraging French military support, especially sea power. Now, Winston Churchill once said that the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without one. And the Americans quickly discovered the truth in Churchill's statement. Having the French on our side wasn't a cure-all. They proved to be difficult allies. Still, they started with welcome naval support, and finally in 1780, the French landed an army in America that would ultimately combine with Washington's ending in the final and decisive American victory at Yorktown. Quite simply, the Americans could never have had a Yorktown without a Saratoga. Indeed, none of the elements of Washington's military strategy would have yielded lasting results without Saratoga, nor would Great Britain have.
Kevin, if you can hear me, you froze up for a second.
Faced what was a global war if they had suffered what Pitt called. Okay, am I back?
You're back.
Okay, so thus the great American victory at Saratoga changed the entire character of the revolution. And although Saratoga was not sufficient to guarantee American independence, it was necessary. And it was, as one American general wrote after Burgoyne's surrender, it was the complete victory. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, if you would now use the question and answer icon on the screen to submit your questions, I'll pass them over to Kevin. Kevin, I'll start off with a question. As an engineer, could you comment on the fortifications that Gates put in as defensive works and their use of terrain?
Yeah, it's an interesting story there because he had the use of, he was fortunate that he had the use of Thaddeus Kosciuszko, Colonel Thaddeus Kosciuszko, who was a Polish engineer, very wonderful eye for terrain. And as Gates was moving the army north, he directed his chief of staff and also Kosciuszko to look for favorable terrain on which they could dig in and wait for the British. Kosciuszko goes forward. They first look at some other officers had picked other positions. Kosciuszko thought they were horrible positions because the British would be able to have an advantage. And as they moved forward, they found Bemis Heights, and Kosciuszko said, "This is it." Supposedly that he exclaimed, "This is the place." And so they decide to dig in on Bemis Heights. And then Gates also put Kosciuszko in charge of directing where all the forces were supposed to go and where they were to dig in. So Kosciuszko and Gates have this good eye for terrain, and so they pick this great position. And it's one of the reasons why Gates is loath to get caught up in a big kind of pitched battle because he wants to maintain those great defensive positions on Bemis Heights. Great question.
Good. This question is from Bill. Do you feel that Howe's refusal to march north doomed Burgoyne's plan?
No, I think that's, I don't. In fact, I think of the two competing strategies, I think Howe had the best strategy, frankly. I mean, it would be hard to pull off, but at least he had the right idea. And I think the right idea was, by this time, Howe recognized that the only way that you're going to end this rebellion is if you defeat Washington and that main army. And you know, and how are you going to do that? You're not going to do that messing around on the Hudson River Valley. You've got to track down and destroy Howe's army. Now, did Howe not coming, the direct question, did Howe not coming up the Hudson doom Burgoyne to failure? Well, Burgoyne didn't think so because Burgoyne knew before he even left Canada that Howe wasn't coming up the Hudson. And so he was utterly unconcerned about his ability to get to Albany. It was only after the fact, when he's looking for excuses and he's looking for the blame, and he's you know trying to blame people, that he blames Howe, he blames Germain, he blames just about everybody but himself. So no, I don't buy that. I mean, that's a common thing that you see historians talk about, but I don't buy that at all. Because you got to remember, you know, Howe is the general, he's the commander in chief. His plan has been approved by the king and Germain, so he's going to execute his plan. And so, you know, if anything, you need to blame, to me, you know, the primary blame needs to go on Germain for not having a good feel for operations in North America by telling Howe, okay, go to Philadelphia, but once you're done, you need to go back up and help Burgoyne. Well, he doesn't understand that in America, campaigning, you can't just turn on a dime. It might take a while for Howe to take Philadelphia, and he's got to fight that. He wants to fight that defensive battle, and then going up and helping Burgoyne 300 miles away. That's kind of tough to do. You might be able to do it on the plains of Germany, where Germain has some experience, but doing it in the wilderness of America, and especially once you get up into New York, is going to be really tough. So no, I don't buy that.
And for anybody who wants to, we have Burgoyne's report to Parliament that he wrote when he was returned to England that basically blamed everybody else.
Yeah, absolutely. I used that extensively in the AHEC archives. There, a little plug for AHEC. I spent
a little bit for AHEC.
Many weeks going over that.
We always have to get the side story, the Burgoyne's relationship with some women in Canada. How did that affect the?
I don't even get into that. I don't think it was a big deal at all. I don't think it affected it at all. I don't even talk about it. I mentioned it in the book. I don't get into it.
You don't go into details. Okay. Nope. I'm not familiar with this. What were your thoughts about the Bachelor letter?
The Bachelor letter. Yes. Okay. Oh, I think the Bachelor letter is highly significant. Now, this is for folks who don't know, the kind of standard story of Saratoga is that, the headstrong Arnold basically wins the Second Battle of Saratoga, while Gates is hiding in a tent and not really involved, and Burgoyne rides off without orders, all this stuff. Okay, so I've never felt comfortable with that. That never rang true to me, that story, but that's kind of the standard account. A letter appeared several years ago on eBay from a officer, an adjutant to, if I remember right, one of the New Hampshire units. And he was there on Bemis Heights, an eyewitness, and he was known to be a good source. And this letter came to light that he had written to his wife just a day or two after the battle, that he relates the fact that Arnold and Gates are talking to each other. They're talking about the fight. Arnold comes back and asks Gates to allow him to commit another brigade to the fight. Gates says yes. So Gates is actively managing the fight. They're not at each other's throats. Clearly, Arnold had not been relieved of command, which some accounts talk about. So the Bachelor letter, I think, is very important. When you combine the Bachelor letter with old source material that's out there that contradicted the standard source, which is mainly based on Colonel Wilkinson's account, his memoirs, written many years later. I think it really changes how we look at how that second battle, how the second battle played out, and the respective roles of Arnold and Gates. It doesn't diminish Gates's role, or excuse me, it doesn't diminish Arnold's role at all. But it does show that Gates was actively controlling the American forces, and that the two men were once again on speaking terms.
This question comes from George. He says, basically, after the Battle of Bennington, the Brits seemed doomed to defeat. Was there any point during the campaign when they could have been victorious in the Hudson Valley?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. And when I get a question like that, which is a great question, I go back to Alexander Hamilton. And Alexander Hamilton at this time, remember, he's 23, I think. He's one of Washington's aides, and he, in the spring of 1777, when all of the New England governors in New York, all the states, are really concerned about a potential second invasion from Canada, which they think is going to come. Of course, they're right. And they're worried that Howe will go up the Hudson River and they'll link up and, something horrible will happen. And Hamilton writes this wonderful letter, and I forget which state he writes to. I want to say it's Massachusetts. But he basically says, look, on paper, it sounds really good, but in practice, it would take an immense army to actually control the Hudson River Valley. And the British don't have an immense army. They don't have those resources to be able to do that and conduct military operations. And I think Hamilton is absolutely right. So as a 23-year-old, he's got, and of course, he could be reflecting what Washington thinks as well, which is very possible. Because he's, Washington's aide, he's with Washington all the time. He knows what Washington is thinking. But, I think that's the correct strategic view. It looks good on paper, it sounds good on paper, but actually pulling it off and being able to get something out of that campaign, a strategic outcome that would be favorable, it would be very, very difficult.
This is a combined question, in a sense, from Dave and Joe, that focuses on Arnold and what happened at Saratoga, especially his wounding, and how that may have affected his subsequent actions, eventually leading to his becoming a traitor.
Yeah. Of course, he's seriously wounded at the second battle. And, just another indication that the two men are at least on speaking terms again. When Gates writes his report of the second battle, he's very, very complimentary of Arnold. Calls him the gallant Arnold and all this. So again, I think they're back on pretty decent speaking terms at that point. But anyway, he's seriously wounded. He's wounded in a leg that had already been wounded. So, he's in bad shape for a while. Washington, obviously doesn't want to lose the services of this, really, aggressive, wonderful combat commander. So, as part of his convalescence, he sends him up to West Point to be the commander up at West Point. And of course, Arnold is still stewing. He doesn't think that, he's still stewing over the fact that he wasn't promoted to Major General with other folks that he thought were beneath him. He thought he didn't get enough praise for the Battle of Freeman's Farm. He doesn't think he got enough credit for the Second Battle of Saratoga. He sees Gates rising in popularity in America. And he thinks that should be him. All these things. So he's the guy he's a wonderful combat commander, but he's just so what do you want to say? He's got to have this praise. He's got to have this adulation, and he doesn't feel like he's getting his due. And so that's what really, I think, drives him to his treason at West Point. It's just the fact that he just doesn't think that he's gotten the credit that's due him. And of course, you look back at what he's done. He's been everywhere, right? He was at Ticonderoga when they seized it in 75. He's at Quebec. He's at the Battle of Valcour Island. He's at all through the Saratoga campaign. But he thinks he should be on par with Gates and with Nathaniel Greene and others, and he's
not. This is from Ed. Leger's force never seemed to be strong enough to have an impact on the campaign, unless, regardless of the results of Fort Stanwix. Do you agree with that?
Not entirely, because when they conduct that operation, it's a supporting force. It's not meant to be the main combat force. It's meant to draw off combat power away from the American main army to allow Burgoyne to have an easier way to get down to Albany. So it was never meant to be the major combat force. So it was meant to be plenty big enough to get down the Mohawk River, though, and to threaten the Americans coming in on their flank. What they didn't expect, and what their intelligence told them, was that Fort Stanwix was a derelict fort. It probably didn't even have any Americans manning it because it was in such poor shape. It was a bit of a surprise when they show up at outside Stanwix and they find that no, there's this plucky American garrison commanded by this colonel, this young colonel, who wasn't going to fold like Sinclair did at Ticonderoga.
This would be more of a what if question. What if Burgoyne had made his main effort down the Mohawk?
Probably they would have been able to seize Ticonderoga fairly. Oh, I'm sorry, Stanwix. They probably could have done it because they would have had overwhelming force, and also Burgoyne had a larger artillery train than Saint Leger did, because Saint Leger didn't think he'd need to do any sort of siege, so he didn't bring a lot of artillery with him. Burgoyne did, but certainly Schuyler and Gates would have moved up the Mohawk to face Burgoyne ultimately. But that's a really interesting question, because you wouldn't have had the same sort of wilderness issues in the Mohawk Valley. Is a little bit more, there's more settlements around there. The roads are a little bit better in a lot of places. Well, it would have been interesting had they come down there. I don't know. I love what if questions though. What if questions are fantastic. I love them.
We'll war game that thing sometime.
Yeah.
Question about this campaign and what can be drawn, those lessons from this campaign into today. So
yeah,
what can you take from this?
Absolutely. I actually think there can be quite a bit drawn from this. In fact, my entire last chapter in the book is about lessons that I would hope that any leader could take a look at and maybe pull some lessons out. And I think the thing that makes my book a little bit different from the standard accounts of Saratoga, there's many wonderful books about Saratoga, but I focus in on, even though I covered the entire campaign from start to finish, I really zero in on leadership and strategy. And so I think, I look hard at all the senior leaders in particular and their leadership traits and how they did as leaders. I try to be as balanced as I can with that assessment. So I think there's a lot of great leadership examples you can draw from different leaders on the American and the British side. There's great leaders on both sides. There's leaders who aren't so great on both sides. And then for strategy, though, I think there's really a lot of great things that you can pull from this. Things like, you really need to have a unified, coherent, coordinated strategy. You have to have a strategy that has a clearly defined, decisive, and attainable objective. You have to have a strategy that looks closely at all the assumptions that you make as you create your strategy. Now, there's nothing wrong with making an assumption. You have to make an assumption, assumptions. Why? Because you're never going to have 100% of all the information you have to have. So you have to make a certain assumption, but you have to carefully look at those assumptions, and you have to ask yourself, if my assumption doesn't come true, if that assumption is wrong, then I have to have a plan to counter that assumption or to deal with that. For instance, Burgoyne, as he's coming down into, as he passes Fort Ticonderoga and moves into New York, his assumption was that there's huge numbers of loyalists up there, and they're all going to flock to him. They're going to be able to provide him with food and transport and all the things that he departed from Canada with some shortages. And he had made that assumption very early on, that there was going to be all these great loyalists that would come out to help. Yeah, it didn't happen. And so when that didn't happen, Burgoyne had to have some sort of okay, now that doesn't happen, what am I going to do? So he doesn't do that. So that's really an important lesson for strategists. And that's just a small handful, Mike.
Last question before we let you make some closing comments. It really focuses on Washington's allowing Morgan and Arnold to move north to support Gates and the impact that may have had on Washington in his defense around Philadelphia, especially at Brandywine.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's, you know, that's possible. He sends these really important forces up there. But he, you know, he's doing what a command, and you know, you can what if that one to death too. If he had Morgan, you know, things definitely may have been different down there at Brandywine. Uh, but again, you know, he's looking at the big picture, and he's also reacting to Schuyler's, you know, panic. And I think he really thinks that he's got to buck up Schuyler. And, you know, how best to buck up Schuyler? Well, you know, clearly Sinclair, you know, who's Schuyler's second in command up there, he hasn't shown much, you know, after abandoning Fort Ticonderoga so quickly. So, you know, who best to put a little steel in Schuyler's spine? Well, you know, maybe you send up your best, most aggressive combat commander. And, you know, that guy is who? It's Benedict Arnold. He knows that Schuyler is having trouble with militia, getting militia to come out. Well, who do you send up there? You send a militia-friendly guy who's been proven to be able to deal really well with militia. You send up Benjamin Lincoln, Major General Benjamin Lincoln. And who best to counter Burgoyne's Native American allies? Well, probably you ought to send up, you know, maybe your most elite fighting force, Daniel Morgan and his riflemen. As it turns out, by the time Morgan's guys get up there, most of Burgoyne's Native Americans have deserted by that time. And so Morgan finds himself not fighting Native Americans, but fighting the British regulars, which turns out to be obviously serendipitous. It turns out great for the Americans. But I think Washington's looking at that big picture, and that's what he's having to deal with.
Okay. Well, Kevin, I want to thank you for a great presentation tonight. Enjoyable for me when I get back into the colonial era.
Yeah, I know how much you like that, Mike.
Yeah, I did. And a plug for his book. I know it's available on Amazon and stuff, but it's also available here in the museum shop at the AHEC. So if you want to come by, we have them on the counter waiting for you to pick some up. Do you have any closing comments as we end tonight?
No, well, except to say thank you very much, and thanks everybody for coming out. Really appreciate the questions are wonderful. Really made me think, and so I enjoy that. So really enjoyed that, and I hope you enjoy the book because again, I think it complements a lot of these other wonderful Saratoga books. It doesn't necessarily replace them, but I think it complements what a lot of these other books do. So I think you'll enjoy it. So thanks a lot, Mike, for the opportunity.
Well, thank you again for this evening. If anybody has additional questions, go ahead and email them to me, and I will pass them on over to Kevin, and hopefully he'll be able to have time to answer them. So good night, and we'll see you next week. I think we're moving up into to Vietnam, so we'll make a 2-century leap.
Yeah.
So, we'll see you next week if you want to come by. Thank you.